series, where we showcase the latest books on nationalism, territorial politics, and ethnicity. I'm your host, Javier Carbonell, and I'm very pleased to have with us today Caroline Gray as our guest. Caroline is a lecturer in politics and Spanish at Aston University and deputy co-director of the Aston Center for Europe. Today, we will have a conversation about her latest book, Territorial Politics and the Party System in Spain, Continuity and Change since the Financial Crisis. So thank you very much, Caroline, for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
So after I ask Caroline some questions, the members of the audience will be able to ask her anything they wish using the chat functions in Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube, and I'll pass the questions on to our guest. If you have any technical issues, please let us know and we will assist you. But before we start, a quick reminder that the call for papers for the 2021 ASEN conference closes on January 15th. So the conference runs from the 6th of April to the 8th and will be held entirely online. The topic is nationalism and crisis, so quite timely. And our speakers include Jasbir Puar, Cynthia Miller-Idris, and Bart Bonikowski. So please do apply if you have an abstract or a paper. All the details, you can find them on our website at asen.ac.uk/conference. So having said that, we get right into it. But before we start to discuss your book, Caroline, I would like to ask you who your favorite scholar on nationalism is, and what is your favorite book on the subject?
Okay, well, I don't think I could pick one scholar actually, because I've learned quite a lot from different people. But if I was to pick one book that I found particularly useful in the past few years, I think I'd probably pick Jaime Yuke's Visions of Sovereignty, because he talks about, the different drivers behind nationalist party behavior and how their trajectories can change over time. They don't necessarily move in one linear direction. And I found that helpful in how I think about the Basque and Catalan nationalist parties in particular.
Oh, thank you very much. So my next question is, how did the project came about, and what literature are you responding to?
Okay, so really the idea first came to me when I was writing my PhD. I wrote my PhD on how the different regional financing systems in Spain had influenced the behavior and strategies of the Basque and Catalan nationalist parties. And I was doing the field work for that back in 2014, 2015 in the Basque Country and in Catalonia. And at that time, obviously, it was the start of when we were beginning to see new parties emerging at a statewide level in Spain. And it was, quite a moment of change. And I think whilst I was doing my PhD fieldwork in the Basque Country and Catalonia, I became aware of the extent to which regionally based parties can influence and shape national politics in Spain. And then when new parties did start to emerge and Spain started to enter a period of party system reshaping like we saw elsewhere, across the Western world in the wake of the financial crisis, and I became interested in how the territorial dimension of politics in Spain was contributing to that party system reshaping in Spain. So thinking of what literature the book responds to, I read widely on the literature that started to emerge in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, the literature that started to emerge on party reshaping in the Western world, party system reshaping and restructuring, and the causes and consequences of that. Quite a lot of cross-country comparative studies started to emerge about, why certain types of challenger parties were emerging in some countries and other types of challenger parties in other countries, and obviously the decline of mainstream parties. And Spain seemed to fit with a lot of what that literature was saying, the Spanish experience, but it did seem to stand out in terms of the extent to which territorial politics was influencing the party system restructuring at a national level. I mean, other countries that have had similar issues territorially to Spain, if we think of like Italy and other countries with decentralization models, the regional and politics and territorial politics didn't seem to be influencing national politics as much in that post-crisis period as it was in Spain. So I became interested in how and why that was happening. And some of the literature, if we think of there was a 2018 paper by Hutter, Creasy and Vidal, which highlighted the fact that, say, the territorial dimension seemed to be more salient in Spain than elsewhere. And so that, I got interested in exactly how and why that was happening, and to what extent the territorial dimension was influencing wider party system restructuring in Spain. And some of the authors, if I think of the authors that I was reading that I found particularly interesting, people like Huge and Marx in a paper of theirs, and I think there was another paper by Hernandez and Creasy, I think it was, where they were talking about concepts like, they were saying that really that the financial crisis served as kind of a catalyst for changes that had already been in part underway beforehand. And I found that quite an interesting notion when looking at Spain and thinking, to what extent is the financial crisis accelerating changes that had already been happening in the party system, or is it causing those changes to happen in a different way to before? So that's really the context that the book's situated in.
No, I mean, definitely, I think it's one of the best contributions of the book for those of us who read both kind of territorial politics literature and this party change literature. For me, it was very refreshing to see this combined. And I think there's a lot of dialogue that can happen. So definitely a great combination. So now on to the main question. What is the main argument of the book? So what are you defending? How did territorial politics influence party change in Spain?
Okay, well, I think, I argue that it played a profound role really in the party system reshaping and the dynamics of government formation and all the other broader political dynamics that were happening. But I do argue that ultimately the territorial question had a much bigger influence on the right than on the left at statewide level. I mean, in the book, I do an in-depth examination of the behaviour of the different statewide parties, both old and new, from 2015 to 2019, over the period of change, after the 2015 elections where challenger parties broke through for the first time. And I look at the evolution of their behaviour over that 4-year period and what drove both old and new statewide parties' behaviour. And I think really I came to the conclusion that even if it seemed on the left initially, Podemos came with kind of proposing quite a different vision to any statewide party before, with its view of a plurinational Spain in which regions it was saying should have the right to self-determination. So it seemed at first, back in 2014, 2015, that Podemos and the PSOE were on quite a different, were proposing quite different ideas towards Spain's territorial question. Ultimately, analysing the behaviour of the left, both the PSOE and Podemos, over the crucial years that we've had since 2015, what I came to the conclusion was that ultimately, really, that what has allowed them to collaborate or not at different periods over that time have been really questions of economic policy. If they're on the same page on economic matters, they've managed to collaborate. But beyond that, also broader strategic considerations of when it's beneficial to one or the other to collaborate with each other or to compete with one another. And that really became much more important than the territorial question. I mean, ultimately, Podemos ceased to present a referendum in Catalonia as a kind of a red line. That didn't prevent it from reaching agreements with the PSOE in other issues, and it prioritised other issues. Whereas for the right, really, I found looking at the PP, looking at Ciudadanos, and then more recently Vox, that even if, the territorial question is not the only thing that's driven their behaviour, it did become decisive, much more decisive for their behaviour than on the left. So I think that's, the main argument of the book is that the territorial dimension of politics has played a crucial role in party system reshaping and the dynamics of government formation in Spain in the wake of the financial crisis, but ultimately it was more decisive for the behaviour of the right than the left. And I would say, another argument, since I focus on dynamics of continuity and change, is that there has actually, just even though it seems like there's been a lot of change in terms of statewide politics in Spain, there's also been a lot of continuity. If we look at things like, say, the PSOE's territorial policy has actually remained remarkably consistent, even if there has been a bit of, strategic shifting from Sanchez, depending on the moment, actually, that it's remained remarkably consistent. And similarly, if we look at certain things like, even if, say, the Catalan parties, their behaviour towards when they're willing to ally with central government seems to have changed quite a bit. If you look at some other actors like the Basque Nationalist Party, their behaviours remained remarkably consistent. So I think there's been a lot of continuity as well as change.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think as citizens, what you mentioned regarding the PSOE's position, we definitely did not see that as continuity, I think, within them. every year, or every moment that these strategic changes were happening. But it was really good to read the book and really have a bird's view of the whole process, and realize the degree of continuity that actually the SOE had maintained. So my next question goes actually more with regarding to Podemos, because you have argued that Podemos has been an important innovator within the left by explicitly articulating the plurinational character of Spain. However, at the same time, and I think this was also a break with the far left to up to them, they also explicitly articulated a very strong defense of Spanish national identity, of kind of patriotism based on left-wing values, based on defending the social security system, based on our progressive civil rights laws, being prideful for the left-wing kind of character of the Spanish nation. However, I find that over the last years, both Podemos stress on the rhetoric of plurinationality of Spain and on Spanish, patriotism have diminished. So my question is, if we could read this as part of the left's failure to redefine what it is to be Spanish and claim national identity from the right, at least it seems like the right seems to have a bit of an issue ownership of the issue. No? So, and then a bit more of a general question is the saliency of national questions a problem for the left? Does the left see this more as a problematic issue or as an opportunity that they can use to gain votes? And if it is a problem, will always be like this, or is there any way to reclaim Spanish national identity for a left-wing project?
Well, it's a good question, and I think it is very difficult for the left. I mean, if we think about it, prior to Podemos, I mean, the PSOE had tried at times, say in the 1990s, they tried to articulate a kind of a more of a democratic patriotism, but that hadn't really worked, and it had ended up being appropriated again by the right from the sort of the early 2000s onwards. And I think even to this day, I think there's a recognition even within part of Podemos that it is very difficult. I mean, one of the people I interviewed for the book was Mary Peter, who was the Podemos's first sort of secretary for plurinationality, and I asked her, I interviewed her, it was after the Andalusian regional elections of 2018, and I asked her, how do you interpret Podemos's performance at those elections? Obviously they didn't do as well as they wanted, and the right actually gained quite a lot of votes. And I think in her response she mentioned the fact that there was a recognition within the party that their attempts to put forward a different kind of patriotism based on social justice, on left-wing measures, weren't reaching voters in the same way as the right-wing version of patriotism was. So I think there was a recognition even within the party that it's very difficult. So I think it is going to always be very difficult for the left to build that kind of vision. And obviously, now we have got a scenario where we have got left-wing parties of very different natures who have agreed a budgetary agreement. So one could think, well, maybe that's going to be a step in a new direction. But I think it's far too early to say, because I think it's unlikely that parties like Esquerra and Bildu will give their support freely to the PSOE longer term without concessions on the territorial question. But I think it's very difficult to, obviously we can't predict the future, but I struggle to see how that kind of alliance will last longer term if the PSOE remains in its current position on the territorial question. But obviously I'm no predictor of the future. So I think it is difficult for the left to articulate a vision, but I think it's not just a question of can they articulate a vision of what what national identity in Spain should be from a left-wing perspective. I think another question is that there are different views within the left of what that should be. You have still got large sectors of the PSOE and some of Podemos as well, especially since they joined with Izquierda Unida and they became more firmly a left-wing party rather than, originally they were trying to be a transversal party. Those sectors, for them, the kind of the decentralization that the left has traditionally supported has always been meant to ensure equality of opportunities. It's not meant to ensure differentiation. It's why we've always had, the left has always been very much in favor of, the social security system remaining as a caja única, as they talk about, the single fund. They don't want to break that down because decentralization in that traditional left-wing view is meant to ensure equality of opportunities, not differentiation. Whereas now, so you've still got that feeling within a large swathes of the left, but at the same time, you've now got the new left, a lot of that is allying with left-wing forces that have emerged locally, at local-based level, at regional level, where they do support the right to self-determination. And so that has now become another aspect of the new left. And if actually that's quite coherent with the new left in that it did advocate sort of popular sovereignty rather than the institutions and the politicians. So if you look at some of Iglesias's early speeches back in 2014, 2015, when he's talking about, the people and the rights of the people, often he talks interchangeably about, the people as in the Spanish people or the people as in the Catalan people. And it's that kind of popular sovereignty which can be interpreted in both ways. So I think there are now, it's difficult for the left to articulate a vision of kind of democratic patriotism based on left-wing values. It's difficult because, as some sectors within the left have recognized, that hasn't managed so far at least to hit home with certain sectors of Spaniards as much as the right-wing vision. But at the same time, it's not just that the difficulty is also that you've got different views now within the left on how to deal with Spain's territorial issues. And so there's no consensus really. And at the moment, the left has reached, a consensus has been reached between PSOE, Podemos and some pro-independence regionally based actors. But it's very difficult to say whether that consensus will last for any length of time if the PSOE doesn't shift on the territorial question and how to deal with what certain sectors of the Basque Country and Catalonia are asking for.
Yeah, no, I mean, couldn't agree more. So I'm sorry because you said you cannot predict what's going to happen, but I cannot go by not asking you what you think is going to happen on the next Catalan elections. I know this is a terrible thing to ask a political scientist to forecast, but so I mean, my question is more focused on the role of the territorial dimension within the next Catalan elections that's going to happen in February, and the possibility of, some people have been talking about, of the return of the right-wing, left-wing axis. And so the possibility of maybe forming a left-wing government that includes pro-independence and pro-constitutionalist parties as a way to break the territorial dynamics and the territorial cleavage that has been dominating the Catalan elections over the past 10 years, or maybe not. So my question is, how do you see the strength of this cleavage for the next Catalan elections in February?
Yeah. Yes, it's very difficult to say really, but I find it difficult to see the left-right axis dominating over the territorial one. I mean, it's one thing at national government level. Yes, we've seen the Esquerra being willing to support the PSOE and Podemos on the budget, but obviously that's an arena where the territorial question is not the primary question. At Catalan level, it is quite different. And I find it difficult at the moment to envisage a left-wing government in Catalonia where there would be both Esquerra and the socialists. I mean, it's looking likely that Esquerra will win the elections, though obviously the polls don't always get it right. And there's so much, there's a lot of movement within Junts per Catalunya and PDeCAT and all of that. So it's quite difficult to see. But if Esquerra does win the elections, I mean, I do think they would be looking to primarily to form a government with Junts per Catalunya but also, Podemos, Catalunya en Comú, that part of the left. I think it's very likely that they would try and incorporate that part of the left, which believes in the right to a referendum, even if not necessarily full independence. But I find it difficult to see at the regional level the Catalan socialists working together with Esquerra. I mean, we have to remember that they did try that in the past when there was the tripartito, the three-party left-wing coalition government of Esquerra, the socialists and the Greens back in the early 2000s. And that didn't really end very well for the Catalan socialists. And since then, the Catalan socialists have become much more firm defenders of wanting Catalonia within Spain, of not supporting the pro-independence agenda. And I think really the socialists will be looking to get back the voters that they lost to Ciudadanos, so back at the last Catalan elections. And they're not going to be likely to get those voters back if there's any hints that they might be willing to join a left-wing government. So, at the moment, it is difficult to foresee, because obviously we could end up with a scenario where the pro-independence parties don't have an absolute majority of seats. They have, at the last two elections, ended up with an absolute majority of seats, but less than 50% of the votes. So it's not like a comfortable position that they're in to win definitely an absolute majority. I think if the pro-independence parties are close to an absolute majority together, they would probably most likely look to try and bring the Podemos, Catalunya en Comú, those forces under their different brandings into a government. So we'll need to wait and see. But I do find it difficult at the moment, as I say, difficult to predict the future, so I could be totally wrong. I do find it difficult at the moment to see Esquerra and the socialists working together within the Catalan parliament. Even if they can work together within the Spanish parliament, I think it's much harder in the Catalan parliament at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I know this was a difficult or charged question on the future, but thank you very much. I would ask so many more questions, but let's just give the floor to our audience members. And I just want to remind everyone watching us on Zoom, Facebook, or YouTube that you can ask any question, and I'll pass them on to Caroline. So the first question is from Gemma Sala, and she says, regarding the continuity of territorial politics in the Socialist Party, do you expect it to remain the same given Diaz in Andalusia, right? Diaz's competition with radical Spanish nationalist Vox positions, especially if Vox continues to grow? You want me to repeat that just in case?
That's okay. No, I think I've got that. And it's a very interesting question, actually, because one of the things I talk about in the book, actually, is what happened within the PSOE when you had Susana Diaz facing competition within Andalusia from these right-wing parties for the first time. The right managed to gain ground, and Diaz was among the sectors of the PSOE that really weren't very happy when Sanchez was moving a bit more towards Podemos's plurinational kind of vision. Ultimately, that debate was, cut short when really Sanchez did win the primaries, and he remained in firm control of the party, and the PSOE realized it needed to get behind Sanchez. But I think also, actually, if you look at it, one of the things I talk about in the book is the fact that even when it seemed like the PSOE has shifted more towards Podemos's plurinational vision or whatever, it's actually, if you look carefully at the wording of what it proposes, it still remained in favor of sole sovereignty for the Spanish state and the Spanish government. So there was at one stage a point when Sanchez was proposing a kind of a slight change to the Spanish constitution, and Diaz from Andalusia and various other barons within the party were getting a bit nervous about this, and they weren't in favor of that. But then the debate kind of was calmed down, and because actually the wording of what Sanchez proposed was recognizing Spain as plurinational in terms of having different identities, but sole sovereignty would still remain within the Spanish state. So I think, given the issue in regions like Andalusia, with the socialists facing increased competition from the right, because the left-wing vision of the likes of Podemos didn't gel on the territorial question within Andalusia. Yes, the socialists within Andalusia are not going to want to move further towards a Podemos-type stance. They are going to want to stick with the socialist, view of, yes, decentralization to assure equality of opportunities, but sole sovereignty for the Spanish state. And so I think territorial, the PSOE will continue committed to that vision, because it does actually fit, but with what would work for Andalusia as well. But it's just that they might there will be pressure, I think, from regions like Andalusia to articulate that more strongly and not to give more ground to Podemos on a plurinational idea. And that's where we're going to see, there are going to be difficulties, I think, going forward, because we have now got this scenario where at national government level, you've got the PSOE, Podemos, the Bildu, Esquerra, various regionally based forces, supposedly having now formed that Sanchez will hope will be a longer lasting alliance. But it will be interesting to see if that can really work, if the PSOE does remain wedded to its traditional vision of the state.
Yeah, very good. So keeping in with Andalusia, David asks, how could other communities, respond to increased evolution in the Basque Country, Catalonia, and Galicia. So he thinks, for example, Andalusia, and he is arguing: is there a possibility of a re-emergence of a Partido Andalucista, so a specific Andalucist or nationalist Andalucist party? Is the I think I'm gonna add to this question: is the recent break of Teresa Rodriguez and the kind of the Podemos branch of Andalusia an example of Andalucismo? Is it an example of territorial politics? Is it a revival of this national rhetoric? Are they going to be tempted to use that? So how do you see Andalusia within all of this?
I think the dynamics in Andalusia are quite different to elsewhere. I mean, we've obviously always had over the decades this, and it's one of the problems that Spain's territorial model has led to, that there's always been these competitive dynamics among the regions rather than cooperative ones. So anytime, say, the Basques and the Catalans have got something over the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, you then had the other regions wanting to get that particular power too. But I think we did start to see a shift in that actually in the wake of the financial crisis, where you did actually have some of the regions in the south being more willing to hand back some difficult scenarios and not being so demanding for certain powers. I mean, when we saw in the wake of the financial crisis, when lots of the regions were in financial difficulties and the central government started to control regional finances more, there was less resistance to that from some regions in Spain, like Andalusia, than from others like Catalonia. So I think if say Catalonia were to be given, I don't know, I don't actually think this is going to happen, but in a hypothetical scenario, if the Catalans were to receive a financing model like the Basques have got, I don't necessarily think that would unleash demands from Andalusia for the same. But I think it could unleash is demands to make sure that Andalusia is treated equitably in whatever arrangements happen, and that its position, in terms of finances, in terms of how Andalusians are treated, that their position doesn't end up worse as a result of powers given to another region. But I don't think necessarily that the Andalusian government would be looking exactly for what, if Catalans were to get more powers, I don't think the Andalusian government would necessarily be looking for exactly the same powers anymore. So I think we are seeing slight shifts in dynamics in that sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. So there's a question from Jacob, and he's asking: is Vox a neo-fascist political party? So I think this is interesting with regards to both dimensions of Vox that you also talk about in your book. So how the party became relevant through the Catalan crisis, but then has been trying to pressure other elements within its political discourse regarding maybe feminism or immigration, etc., etc. And Jacob also asks if do you think that the PP and Ciudadanos would be willing to work together at a local level. So I think the question is regarding the different alliances that have been going on within the right in Spain.
Yep. Okay, so I think on your first question, I'd actually like to mention here a study by Denison and Mendes. They wrote a really interesting article on Vox where they argued, and I found this argument matched with my own findings then when I was doing interviews. They argued that Vox, I mean, we all know Vox had been around since say 2012, 2013 when Abascal left the PP. But it didn't manage to emerge and actually start winning seats until 2018, 2019. And what Denison and Mendes argue in that paper, sorry, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but if you search for their names, you'll find it. They argue that for the far right to emerge in Spain, there needed to be an issue that was seen as palatable, because issues such as speaking out against immigration, such as speaking out against the EU, such as speaking out against certain aspects of gender legislation, etc. It wasn't seen as something palatable to do, but speaking out in favor of Spanish unity was seen as perfectly acceptable. And so they managed to gain ground on that acceptable issue, as it were. But the other issues were always there at the same time. And actually in one part of, in a part of the chapter on my right, on the right in my book, I talk about this actually, that even though it was the Catalan issue that allowed Vox to gain ground, every time they were talking about the Catalan issue in their manifestos and speeches, they were actually subtly linking it to other issues as well. Those issues were always there. And certainly I think since they've gained that ground in 2019 and, you know, gained that strong presence, we have seen that they are starting to be much stronger on those issues, which do put the party in the extreme right category. And they are much more blatant about those issues now than they were, say, perhaps a couple of years before that. So I think, you know, Vox does fit the criteria of an extreme right, a far right party. I think there's no doubt about that. And even if the Catalan issue was what allowed it to gain ground, the other issues have always been there in the background, and it is now voicing those much more strongly. And I think on the other question you ask about the PP and Ciudadanos and whether they'd be willing to work together at a local level, I think it depends very much on the region. I think in some regions, yes, and in other regions, no. It does depend very much on the region. I mean, if you think of a region such as the Basque Country, there, for example, the Basque PP has always been very much in favour of the economic agreement. So for them to ally with Ciudadanos, which has voiced its opinions against the economic agreement, it is very difficult for them because it's such a difficult issue. But there are other parts of Spain, other regions, where it is feasible for the PP and Ciudadanos to ally together. So I think really it depends on specifically on the local and regional level dynamics as to where they might ally together and where they might not.
Thank you very much. So the next question by Ying Xiao, short but to the point. Is nationalism inherently right-wing or conservative? Very broad question, but yeah, short but very broad.
I think no is the answer, I would say. I mean, traditionally, when we think of nationalism at statewide level, we have often associated it more with right-wing and conservative positions. And certainly, you know, if we think of who embodies Spanish nationalism within Spain, it's your right-wing parties. So at a statewide level, nationalism has generally been associated more with the right. But if we look at what happens at sub-state level, there are different forms of nationalism, and obviously, you know, some parties who are under certain criteria considered nationalists don't actually like that label. I mean, if we think of a lot of the sub-state nationalist parties in inverted commas in Catalonia, they don't like the label nationalist. And some of those are not right-wing. I mean, if you think of Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya, for example, that's your left-wing Republican pro-independence Catalan party. I mean, it combines a vision of pro-independence with a left-wing economic and social agenda. So no, I don't think nationalism has to be right-wing at all. There are other forms of nationalism. If we think of it more as a kind of, you know, different kinds of patriotism, we don't always need to use the word nationalism. But I think we also need to think that that word nationalist has become associated historically with kind of right-wing nationalism, and therefore some sub-state nationalist parties, regionally based parties, don't actually like the term because they see themselves as a different form of nationalism, as it were.
Yeah, again, couldn't agree more. Most of the territorial debates, so the next question is by Pablo Sanchez. Most of the territorial debates in Spain are debates about national identity, but the emergence of the so-called España vaciada or España vacía, so empty Spain in English, point to long overlooked issues of territorial development that had been maybe silenced by the Catalan secessionist challenge. So maybe has a diminished importance of the process of maybe the last year or of the last years enabled the emergence of other territorial questions that were not so important in public debate in Spain?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, certainly we see huge discrepancies across Spain in terms of territorial development. Like you say, they're one of the big challenges Spain faces is rural areas that you know, are becoming increasingly depopulated. And that is a big challenge. I mean, and if you look at, say, the regions which struggle most economically in Spain, like the ones of the south, they are largely the regions with large rural areas that have become depopulated. In terms of whether that's become silenced, I think actually what's quite interesting is that one of the arguments of your Catalan pro-independence side is that the way say, Spanish infrastructure has been built over the years, has been built in a way that favours the capital, Madrid. You know, one of the arguments, if you read some of those academics that have written about, from, I'm thinking of people like Jerome Abel, who is an academic, but also quite a pro-independence supporter, and his work on infrastructure and nation building, you know, he talks about how the way the infrastructure has been built in Spain, you know, if I'm thinking of things like the fast-speed rail networks, have all been designed to favour Madrid. So the Catalan nationalists argue against that as a kind of, you know, well, it's been designed to favour Madrid rather than other aspects of, rather than Catalonia. But you can also look at it from a different perspective, that perhaps things like that have favoured more the capitals and the big towns and not so much the rural areas that need a boost. I mean, I think there are positives coming forward in as you know, the recent budget announcements with the new coalition government saying, recognizing that things like, you know, investment in research and development and all these sorts of issues need to be addressed. And I think then, you know, there does need to be a step further in thinking, well, these kinds of issues that need to be addressed, there also need to be, it also needs to be considered territorially as to where those issues need to be addressed most. I mean, if I think, you know, I was just looking recently with students of mine, actually, I do finally a module on assessing country risk in Spain and looking at where investors go in Spain. And we were looking at, you know, where foreign investment in Spain is the most and where it's been growing the most. And actually it's been growing the most, not surprisingly, in the north of Spain. But even more, even in those regions which in the north, which traditionally haven't been that wealthy, it's been growing far more there than, say, in the south of Spain. Why? They're not being attracted to south of Spain. These are the sorts of issues that need to be addressed. So I think, you know, I'm sort of rambling a bit, but I think some of the issues the Catalan nationalists have raised in terms of saying that things are too focused on Madrid does actually have relevance for other parts of Spain too. But then at the same time, you've got the issues of, if, say, the Catalans were to get a better deal under the financing system and all of that, but it's the regions in the south of Spain that would struggle the most if that were to happen. So there's difficult issues really for Spain to address on lots of territorial questions, really.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Dani Cetra, and she says, and he says, so as you have already pointed out, the left in Spain and elsewhere often attributes lower salience to territorial issue compared with right-wing parties, which allows PSOE and Podemos to shift their position. Wait a moment, it's a long question. To shift their position on the national question. Do you see a scenario in which this could change? So under which circumstances could the Spanish right make their mononational conception of the state a little less rigid, or perhaps make the national question less central in their approach to territorial issues? Or will we continue to see pronounced shifts in party positions only within the left?
It's a very good question and a difficult one, but yeah. I think it, you know, if we look at what happened in 2019, you would think that the right might learn from what happened in that, you know, if we look at what happened, the April 2019 general elections, you had your three right-wing parties, Vox, the PP and Ciudadanos, all fighting to try and be the most in favor of a Spanish unitary state, to try and win all those voters. But ultimately, you know, they just ended up fighting for the same voters, as it were. And, you know, the CIS polls that show positioning of voters in Spain have consistently shown that on a scale of sort of 0 to 10, if the 10 is the most right wing and 0 is the most left wing, most of your voters in Spain are sort of between 3 and 5. So advocating those very right wing positions, and obviously right wing positions in Spain are not just on economic questions, they are related to things like territorial questions, captures a certain part of the electorate, but not all of it. And so given, you know, we saw what happened when Ciudadanos lost so many votes after and seats, having taken that particular stance of not being willing to ally with the socialists and to downplay territorial questions, to ally with the socialists, of competing with the right for those most right-wing voters. Given that those parties were essentially competing for the same voters and it wasn't proving beneficial really to them, I think you would think that they would look at that and realize perhaps some more flexibility is needed. so that we don't just talk about that one issue. And I think there could become a circumstance where that's possible if the Catalan issue is not so much in people's mind. I mean, obviously at the time of those 2019 elections, the Catalan issue was really salient because of all that had happened after the attempted referendum in 2017, then the court cases against the politicians. It was such a salient question that it really wasn't possible for them at that stage to think about other things. And actually, I remember a Ciudadanos representative saying that to me in an interview. He said, back in 2016, when we were talking to the PSOE, the Catalan issue wasn't so salient. We could work with the PSOE on other issues and prioritize other issues. That wasn't possible in 2019. So I think there could, if the Catalan issues continues to bumble on but isn't so central as it was back in 2019, I think we could see a situation where right-wing parties are more willing to shift a bit, but I think only to an extent. I don't think we'll see as much shifting as we have seen on the left, where really they can prioritize other issues more easily. But to be honest, having said that, I think the left is going to find it difficult to, if Podemos and the PSOE are trying to work with Bildu and Esquerra longer term, I think they're going to find it difficult to shift positions ambiguously. I think Esquerra, the likes of Esquerra and Bildu, will want a firmer position if they're to work together longer term.
Thank you very much. So we're getting towards the end. So I'm going to ask the last question. This is a question actually touches me closely because it's about the other territorial politics in Spain. So I'm from Valencia. So the question is about parties such as Compromís or BNG or ANOVA in Galicia, which have done at some point relatively well over the past years, but they have not opted for a confrontational approach against the state or in a manner that the Catalan parties have done. So will these parties become increasingly important, and might that lead to a national crisis outside of Catalonia? Can we see something happening like what happened in Catalonia or the Basque Country in other regions? Or might we see kind of the opposite? Might Catalonia and Basque Country converge with the other regions and reduce their saliency and their position?
Okay, it's a very interesting question, and I'm going to be honest and say that I've done most work on Catalonia and the Basque Country. I wouldn't, I think that other regions are fascinating, but sadly I haven't had that much time to go into huge depth about the exact dynamics within the regions. And I do think we have seen that some of the sort of the newer regionally based parties and local parties that have emerged in other regions in the wake of the citizen protests in 2010, 2011. Some of them have managed better than others. Obviously, we've seen different scenarios. It's not been easy for these locally based platforms and regionally based platforms that emerged, kind of primarily left-wing ones, in response to dynamics, in response to reactions against austerity and etc. Some of them have managed to do better than others because there have been a lot of problems in terms of internal coherence and also in terms of how they liaise with other parties. But obviously there are also some of those regionally based parties that have had a longer term position. If we think of things like Coalición Canaria, which has, been there for a long time, often gets sort of 1 or 2 seats in the Spanish parliament and can lend its support as and when it suits it. Those parties have traditionally maintained quite a small presence. But as to whether or not they're going to be able to build their support more or reduce it, I think I would need to do more research on those regions to be able to give you a good answer to that question. So I'll reserve judgment for now, but it's a very good question.
I mean, I hope you do, and I hope to hear your comments and your thoughts on these other territorial politics, political parties. So I'm really sorry, but with that we have to close the event. Thank you very much, Caroline, for joining.
Thank you.
No, for all our audience members, please do read Caroline's book. It's really, really good. Territorial Politics and the Party Change in Spain with Routledge. So really, thank you very much. And I just want to remind everyone that we have more book presentations planned for the following months. So join us in January for a discussion with Venetia Johannes on her latest book, Nourishing the Nation, Food and National Identity in Catalonia. And we're also planning more events on the Catalan elections, Brexit, and all sorts of topics related to nationalism and nationalism studies. So please do join us, and also follow us on social media to be updated about events, deadlines, and call for papers on nationalism studies. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for joining and everyone for participating, and see you next time.